In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the muscular system. And most of our time is going to be spent looking at the structure of a muscle, both macroscopically and microscopically. And then toward the end, we will talk about muscle names. The function of muscles is, of course, to produce movement. It also helps us to maintain posture, stabilize our joints, and to generate heat for our body. Characteristics of muscles. Muscle cells are elongated, and another name for a muscle cell is called a muscle fiber. So you will hear a lot about this term muscle fiber today. The contraction of muscles is due to the movement of microfilaments. We're going to have a note where we look at how muscles contract, so we'll be talking about those microfilaments and how that takes place. All muscles share some terminology, some prefixes that you will see in this unit referring to muscle. Could be myo, mice, or sarco. All of those refer to muscles. Most muscles are attached by tendons to bones, and some muscles will have visible banding patterns. We call these striations. You may remember that term from when we looked at the tissues on muscles. That skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are both striated. The cells are surrounded and bundled by several layers of connective tissue. And as we look at the macroscopic structure, we will talk about all of these layers of tissues. So the first thing that we have, if we're going to start on the inside of the muscle, as small as we can go macroscopically, we talk about the single muscle fiber itself, which is the muscle cell that we see here. Muscle fiber. Y'all know I do that all the time. Muscle fiber. Okay, so that is this section right here. It is covered in a layer of tissue called the sarcolemma, and this is a special name for the plasma membrane of that muscle cell. So it's just the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. It's called the sarcolemma. When we take several of these muscle fibers and group them together, as you can see in this diagram, it is called a fascicle. So this whole thing here is a fascicle. Okay? So we have a muscle fiber and several muscle fibers grouped together called a fascicle. This is wrapped in another layer, and this layer is called the perimysium. It's labeled here. It's the outside of this one, and it's also labeled here, which would be the outside of this particular fascicle. But every fascicle is surrounded by this perimysium. Okay? Now, in between the muscle fibers, we have yet another layer, or another tissue. It's called the endomysium. So the endomysium is in here in between all of these muscle fibers. We have endomysium in here. We have endomysium in here. So all of these are called the endomysium. So it's going to surround all of the muscle fibers. And then finally, when we group all of these fascicles together into one single muscle, we're talking about the muscle as an organ, it is surrounded in another layer called the epimysium. Okay, so from smallest to largest, the layers are the sarcolemma, which you see here. The fascicle itself is wrapped by the perimysium, and then on the inside, filling up the rest of that space, is the endomysium, and then a bunch of the fascicles are grouped together, covered by the epimysium. So you have several different layers there of membranes that cover these muscle fibers. Another couple of terms that you will need to be familiar with in this unit is origin and insertion. So the origin is the point at which the muscle attaches to a structure to provide resistance or to create movement, and the insertion is the point at which the muscle attaches to the structure which is going to be moved. So the insertion is the part that's attached to the muscle or to the structure that will be moved, and the origin is the point of attachment that will create resistance for that movement. Let's take one of these muscle fibers here and see what it is. If we look at the microscopic structure of a myofibril, we just looked at macroscopic. If we go even smaller, so made up of microscopically, then we will see that the cells are multinucleated, so there are more than one nucleus involved in each of those. And we will see that it is made up of smaller units called myofibrils. Here's the sarcolemma that we talked about surrounding the whole muscle fiber. And then myofibrils are even smaller units of that cell. It also contains a sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a specialized type of ER, endoplasmic reticulum, which stores calcium ions. And the calcium ions will be needed to initiate a muscle contraction. The myofibril is made up of myofilaments, and these filaments come in thin filaments, which are made of the protein actin, and thick filaments, which are made of the protein myosin. These two filaments are going to work together to perform a muscle contraction. These are lined up in a way so that sometimes they overlap. You can see if blue is the little blue line is the thin filament, and the red line is the thick filament. Where they overlap is called the A band, and that will produce a dark band, a dark section on the myofibril. And where they don't overlap, we only have the thin filaments. Those are called I bands, and that's going to have a lighter appearance to it. So you can remember this because I bands, the word light has an I in it, and for A bands, the word dark has an A in it. So you can kind of keep those straight that way. A sarcomere is a contractile unit of a muscle fiber. So this is the whole unit that will be involved in the contraction, and that's from one what we call Z line or Z disc to the next. So this whole section right here is a sarcomere. A little bit more about those filaments. The thick filaments, which again are made of myosin, also have enzymes called ATPase. Because this is a muscle cell, we're going to be doing a lot of contraction, so they're going to need a lot of energy. Therefore, they have a lot of mitochondria. Mitochondria produce the ATP for the cell. The thin filaments, which again are made up of actin, have what's called troponin and tropomyosin parts. And we'll see more about those when we talk about the contraction in just a minute. Myosin filaments have what we call heads on them, and I'm going to try to highlight one of these. You can see right here. That's one of the heads that we're talking about. And at rest, when the muscle is not contracting, there is an area that does not have actin filaments, and this is called the M line or the H zone. It's this bare zone here in the middle. And this is a diagram that again shows you this is our muscle fiber, and we're pulling out one myofibril, talking about all those bands and how those overlap. And here you can see those myosin heads. So this is just all of the diagrams that we've looked at so far, kind of put together so you can see how they relate. Properties of muscle fibers that produce movement include irritability. This means that the muscle fiber or cell can receive a stimulus and respond to it. And the stimulus is produced from the nervous system. So the nervous system would stimulate the muscle to either contract or relax. Then contractibility is the ability to shorten when the stimulus is received, and extensibility is the ability to lengthen. That means a stimulus is not being received at that point and the muscle is in a relaxed state. To produce movement, they have to be stimulated by, like I said, the nervous system, and the motor unit of the nervous system that is involved in this is called a neuron. And I'm going to take just a minute here to review the structures. This area where they meet is called a neuromuscular junction. So we're going to look at the neuromuscular junction of a neuron before we move further. If you recall, we have the cell body of the neuron, and it has all of these branches on it. We have a nucleus, and these little branches are dendrites. Okay, and then we have one long branch structure here, which is going to be called the axon. Okay, so these are dendrites. Cell body with the nucleus, and then the axon. And the axon can be what we call myelinated, meaning it can have these layers of myelin on them. This actually makes the nerve impulse be able to travel faster. And then at the end, the axon branches into these axon terminals, also known as terminal buds. So let's see if I can label that for you. Okay, so now how does the impulse travel? Well, the impulse will travel into the cell body through the dendrites, this direction. So that's how it enters the neuron. Then the impulse will travel down the axon away from the cell body and out one of these axon terminals, either to another neuron or, in this case, to a muscle. So we're going to take one of these little terminal buds here, okay, and if we were to enlarge this and look at it more closely, it would look something like this. Okay, so this is the end of that terminal bud, and it's going to come in contact with a muscle fiber here. Okay, so the next set of notes, or the next note that we're going to be looking at, is how the impulse travels from excuse me, this axon terminal bud across this space into the muscle fiber. Okay, so this is what we're going to be looking at in the next part, which is right here. Okay, so the neuromuscular junction, we have the synaptic cleft. Okay, so that space between the axon terminal and the muscle itself is called a synaptic cleft. It's a gap between the two. So the nerve and the muscle do not actually touch each other. And this space is filled with an interstitial fluid. So how does the impulse get across that space? Well, the nerve, the neuron, will release a chemical messenger. And the chemical messenger is called a neurotransmitter. And in skeletal muscle, the neurotransmitter that's most often used is acetylcholine. You might see that abbreviated ACH sometimes on some diagrams. So the neurotransmitter is, again, a chemical messenger. You can see it being produced here, these little blue dots, okay? And it's going to travel across that space and carry the message to the muscle. And there it attaches to receptors on that plasma membrane of the muscle fiber called the sarcolemma, and that allows the muscle fiber to become permeable to sodium ions. So at that point, sodium ions start rushing into the muscle fiber, and that generates what we call an action potential. The sarcoplasmic reticulum then releases calcium ions, and this begins the contraction of the muscle itself. Once started, a muscle has to complete the contraction. Okay, it can't like halfway contract. And this is called the all or none response. Either the entire muscle fiber contracts or it does not contract at all. It cannot partially contract. Again, this is diagram. All of these we've looked at already. It's just showing you all of them put together, so you can see this is the axon terminal bud, and here we have that enlarged for the synaptic cleft, and then those sodium ions rushing in to the muscle fiber. For the sliding filament theory, excuse me, we have ATP on the myosin filament that causes the myosin head to move from a relaxed state to an excited state. The myosin heads would kind of like stand up, like at attention. The release of calcium ions will expose binding sites on the actin filaments, so the heads of the myosin are going to bind to these binding sites on the actin. Myosin heads would bind to the actin sites at the troponin and tropomyosin sites. Once the cross bridges will form, the heads will bend toward the M line or H zone and sort of pull itself across those actin filaments. So the result is a shortened muscle or a contracted muscle. You see that a little bit better here. Here we have the myosin filaments, and these are the heads that we're talking about here. There's one of them. And here we have the actin filaments with the troponin and the tropomyosin. And you can see on letter B, we have a myosin binding site there that is open. Okay, so the myosin heads will grab a hold of the actin and they will pull them together. Okay, and that shortens the muscle itself, the muscle fiber, therefore causing it. Muscle force depends on the number of fibers stimulated. So the more muscle fibers that are contracting, the stronger the muscle will be, or the response of the muscle will be. In a skeletal muscle, not all the fibers can be may be stimulated at the same time. It depends upon what movement we want to produce on which muscle fibers are going to be contracted. These are some types of body movements that can be produced from muscle contraction. And there are several sides of these. I'll just let you look at them. I will point out abduction and adduction because one way you can remember that is adduction is toward the body, so you're adding, like in this case, she's adding her hand back to her body, whereas abduction, if you were abducted, you were taken away, so it is taken away from the body. It's one way you remember those. Within a muscular movement, there will be several muscles that work together at the same time, and each of them may have a different role. So one of the main muscles responsible for producing a movement will be called the prime mover. There will also be a muscle that opposes this movement, and this is called the antagonist. Sort of like in literature, the antagonist is the one that opposes the good guy, right? So the muscle that aids the prime mover, that helps it, will be called a synergist. And there is a muscle that will stabilize the muscle that is moving, the prime mover, and that's called the fixator. Increased muscle use will increase the size of a muscle fiber. You do not get more muscle fibers, you just increase the mass or the size of the muscle fibers that you already have. This can increase your muscle strength and efficiency and the resistance to fatigue, so how long it can stay contracted. When muscles are named, if you will remember, if you can learn some of these terms and what they mean, it will help you identify where these muscles are found in the body and what they look like. Direction of the muscle fibers, rectus means straight. The size of the muscle, if we say maximus, that means large. If we say major, that means large. Whereas if we say minimus, then that would mean small, or minor, that would mean small. The location of the muscle, like the temporalis, if you remember, the temporal bone is on the sides of the cranium by where your temples are. So the muscle that is covering that is called the temporalis. The number of origins, the triceps has 3 heads, hence the name tri, for example. The location of the muscle's origin and insertion, sterno, so that would be connected to the sternum. The shape of the muscle, deltoid, is triangular. the action, if it's a flexor or an extensor. And you'll see some of those names again here on this diagram. I'm going to point out some of these that are super important for you to learn. First is the frontalis. It's named frontalis because it's on the front of the cranium. If you recall, that's called the frontal bone that's underneath there. Orbicularis oculi. Oculi, that refers to ocular, or your eyes, so that's where that's located. Zygomaticus, you remember the zygomatic bone on the cheekbones. Orbicularis oris, oris for oral, so around your mouth. Temporalis, again, by the temple. The masseter muscle, mastication is the process of chewing your food, so the masseter is on the sides of the face, which helps to move that mandible in chewing. Platysma is another one. Sternocleidomastoid. Sterno, there's that prefix, so that muscle is actually going to be attached to part of the sternum. Your deltoid. You have a pectoralis major. If you work out, sometimes you call these your pecs. It's your pectoralis major. You have external intercostal. Inter means between, costal refers to the ribs, so those are between the ribs. Rectus abdominis. Remember, rectus was a long, straight muscle. So you can see how it's shaped there. It is a long, straight muscle, and abdominis refers to your abdomen. External and internal obliques. Transversus abdominis. You also have triceps and biceps brachii. The brachialis muscle. The brachioradialis, remember this is the radius on this side of the arm, on the side where the thumb is found, so that's where that name comes from. You have a flexor carpi radialis and the iliopsis. If we move on down further toward the knee, we will see the sartorius, kind of crosses over the front of the leg. You have an adductor muscle. Your quadriceps group, if you work your quads, you're working your rectus femoris. And again, rectus means long and straight, whereas femoris refers to the femur. Vastus lateralis, it's on the lateral side of the body, which is on the outside. Vastus medialis is toward the inside of the body, or the median. Fibularis longus, extensor digitorum longus, and the tibialis anterior, of course, would be on the front of the tibia. So you can see how some of these names can help you identify the shape and where they're on the body. You'll see some of these twice. This is a close-up here of some of those arm muscles. Some of them we did not identify on the last one are latissimus dorsi, the gluteus medius, and the gluteus maximus. Biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus, and the gastrocnemius muscle. Muscles of the head, we talked about a couple of these already. We talked about frontalis, the temporalis, the platysma, the sternocleidomastoid, the masseter, orbicularis oris, orbicularis oculi, and the zygomaticus. We've already talked about all of those, so just a couple of extra ones here. Occipitalis. If you remember, this is the occipital bone on the back of your head, so that's why it's named occipitalis muscle. And then the buccinator muscle, which is also a muscle involved in chewing. Oh, and trapezius is down here. You can see it a little bit better on a picture of the back. Here again, some of these are on here twice. It's just giving you a closer up view of some of these. I've already talked about them on the whole body diagram. Here you can see the trapezius muscle. Notice how it is shaped. I can't see that. Okay, trapezius muscle. We talked about deltoid, sternocleidomastoid, latissimus dorsi. We talked about all of those. Closer up view of the thigh here. The sartorius, we've already talked about that. The quadriceps groups, we talked about that. Again, it's just a closer up view. So some of these are repetitive. And then finally, the lower leg. This is a posterior view on the right. You can see the soleus and the gastrocnemius. And then the anterior view on the left, fibularis longus, brevis. We already talked about tibialis anterior and extension digitorum longus. So those are some other ones that, there's the soleus again from the front that you may want to memorize. Okay, and that concludes our muscle lecture. Make sure you spend some time reviewing the parts of the muscle fiber, how a muscle contraction works, and also being able to identify some of these muscles on a diagram.